Early in 2020, as reports came in from Wuhan and Italy, we watched in fear as the virus took hold of cities, forcing them to close and soon forcing countries to close. It was a time of information overload, of trying to get our heads around the virus, of understanding what the signs and symptoms are every time you cough. It is during this time that the first case was recorded in South Africa. We knew it would be a matter of time before government had to take drastic action. We were confronted with various models on how this virus might play out. Some of them were devastating. As the cities and countries were closing one by one, lawyers started to ask questions about the constitutionality of some of the measures and how states can and should respond. With ours being a constitutional democracy, the question were how to respond within the parameters of the Constitution. It was the first time in our constitutional democracy that we were faced with a global, let alone national crisis that needed to be managed. So early in March, in the height of fear and anxiousness, the government had to act with little knowledge about the virus. The government had to devise a plan to decide the South African way forward. And people in government, probably dealing with their own fears and uncertainty, had to make these decisions. What complicates the response in South Africa even further is that we are a country with such vast socioeconomic differences, different experiences and needs. How must government make regulations that are equally applicable to all citizens, regardless of our vast different world experiences? When the dead quiet of mid-March dawned on many households, many officials were working frantically behind the scenes, writing regulations with no blueprint for curtailing the spread of an unknown virus to ensure that there is not an overload on an already precarious health system. Today, we are 433 days into lockdown, and we gather here online as we have gotten used to in these 433 days, to look back and assess the government's legal and regulatory response to COVID. My team and I would like to thank you for inviting us to be part of this process of reflection. We have written this report in what has come to be known as the Tumamina spirit, hoping that a view from the outside will aid you in your own reflection as government. The report deals with a period from March 2020 to roughly February 2021. In July 2020, it was foreseen that this chapter will deal with constitutional and policy imperatives of the country related to the managing of the state of disaster and why the disaster option was considered, whether the measures were in line with the applicable international standard, as well as international human rights and the human rights contained in our Bill of Rights. So how did we go about doing this? We accepted, like Chapter 2, that we will be a helicopter chapter, standing back looking at the bigger picture. So the chapter gives a broad principle-based overview of the state's response using specific examples. We did not interrogate each and every regulation. We started by looking at the state's options in the beginning of March, and we evaluate the state's choice of utilizing the Disaster Management Act. After that, we embarked on a somewhat ambitious process where we used certain principles to evaluate the state's response. We use the principles in the values of our constitution that's contained in section 1. The following section then fleshed out specific measurables developed internationally deemed necessary for the state to comply with the rule of law during an emergency. The section ends with a discussion on human rights, which ties in nicely with the next chapter that deals with human rights but focuses more on case law, what happened in the court. To start with, I want to introduce the team. Prof. Himla Sudel was the convener of this chapter. The rest of the authors are listed here, and in the report itself, the institutions are also set out. Our introduction sets the scene by looking at the bigger constitutional framework. It moves on to look at the rule of law specifically. There's also a short explanation about the nature of emergency legislation and international law. Although many of these international law frameworks look specifically at states of emergencies, which is not what South Africa declared, the principles are the same and applicable in this disaster management. And specifically when a state of disaster is declared, as was done in South Africa to deal with COVID. This sets the scene for looking at the state's legal and regulatory options in early 2020. We look at the different options, namely the Disaster Management Act, the State of Emergency Act, and the National Health Act, as the main three possible avenues available to the state. A fair amount of time is spent on the new approach to disaster management that the Disaster Management Act envisioned, as the background of the Act informs how the Acts should be interpreted, and in that sense plays a role in the evaluation part later. We have highlighted here that the Disaster Management Act focuses on risk reduction and creates various institutions that should constantly devise disaster risk reduction plans and drive education on disaster risk reduction. In that sense, the Act is not only something that you utilize once a disaster strikes. It is legislation that requires a constant implementation to ensure that once there is a hazard, we can avoid it becoming a disaster. And if we have a disaster, that disaster's impact is not so severe. I must admit my own initial hesitancy as to the applicability of the Act in April last year. Still, after collaborating extensively with colleagues in disaster management and having these issues aired and explained in court cases, we as a team, myself included, found that the option was indeed the best. There are still some fault lines that government can consider addressing going forward. Without dwelling too much on the state of emergency option, it was found also in court cases that the threshold of restoring peace and order that is required to institute a state of emergency was not met. The National Health Act and other legislation was a limited option. It allows, for instance, for testing and quarantine, but it is doubtful if a lockdown and the other measures needed to address the spread of COVID would be possible under the National Health Act and other ordinary legislation. So what are our suggestions in this regard? The most important suggestion here is to ensure implementation of the Act even in times of no disaster or hazards. The reason why this might have been neglected previously is because it is falling under the responsibility of the Department of Cooperative Governance, while the presidency might be better suited. That is what the draft has had in mind. This ensures that disaster management is everyone's problem, from the presidency to premiers to municipal officers. This then also speaks to the institutions that the Act itself creates. These should be functioning optimally, especially the Interministerial Committee. We also find merit in the concern that the regulations that are made are not required to lie in front of Parliament for input from other parties, as is the case of a state of emergency. While it is within the powers of the Minister to make regulations within the confines of the Act, the fact that a state of disaster is an emergency situation where regulation making takes place very quickly and with relatively little consultation, such a requirement will bolster democracy and allow for multi-party participation. This is especially so when the immediate threat and the novelty of the virus wanes. So these are our suggestions. After this discussion, we assess the state's response within the confines of the Constitution and the legislative framework of the Disaster Management Act. We use 9 principles and guidelines for maintaining the rule of law in a state's response to pandemics, devised by looking at international experience as well. I will quickly go, or you can quickly go through them on the slide with the understanding that when I do discuss each and every principle, I cannot cover everything in detail. Principle 1 is ensuring legal certainty and clarity in public communication. This requires that regulations, rules, and restrictions must be clear and certain in their meaning and consistent in their application. The justification for these rules should also be communicated clearly. Changes should be announced in advance, giving people time to prepare. What's our evaluation? There were times when some of the regulations were not that clear. The DA court case that deals with the vagueness of the criteria of who must benefit for business relief packages is an indication of some of the vagueness. The justification for the rules was not always clearly communicated, especially not when they were promulgated. Here we think of the ban on selling of hot food, the rule on the open-toe shoes, and the 3-hour exercise window, and then the much debated ban on the sale of tobacco. The regulations were often announced in advance, even if the details in the regulations only followed later. In some instances, the regulations did not reflect the announcement, which is something that should be avoided. The second principle is ensuring decision-making is transparent. This speaks to transparency on who makes the decisions and on what basis. Public support and compliance are higher if people have faith in the democratic legitimacy of the decisions. Of course, in a pandemic where there's a reliance on technical and scientific expertise, it is sometimes difficult to clarify. Here, it is helpful if the government, as ultimate decision makers, communicate the reasons behind the decisions, even if it was not based on hard science and taking in other considerations into account, for instance, interaction with other interest groups. Transparency also requires that individuals and businesses know what to do when. Our evaluation. Here, the role of the National Corona Command Council was initially unclear. First, there was uncertainty on who sits on the council. When it transpired it was a cabinet committee, it was unclear what their role were in decision-making. The cabinet is also not an open forum, which means that the citizens don't know how these decisions are made. Some of the information only came out after the state was taken to court. Here we think, for instance, about the tobacco cases. The De Beers case, which arguably is not without its problems, also found that certain rules simply did not make sense. In April, the presentation of Prof. Karim helped a great deal to explain the medical science on which the state's response is based. Initiatives like that should be encouraged. South Africa followed a stage approach or alert level approach from August, which indeed also gave a lot of clarity on what is allowed when and how we will move from certain levels. Principle 3, act in compliance with international law and human rights norms. Measures must be necessary, proportionate, and temporary with respect for human rights and the principle of legality. The executive must not use its powers for anything else than addressing the threat, and it cannot extend to outlast the crisis. So this is a preliminary evaluation because we are still in a state of disaster. And we also deal with human rights later, I should add. But our initial evaluation here is looking at the Causa case, concerns were raised about the criminalization of specific actions and the harsh enforcement measures in some instances. We also discuss here how vulnerable groups were disproportionately affected by COVID, which we will also deal with under a different principle. Principle 4 is deliver rapid, coordinated, and collective action. So here our evaluation says that we thought there was mainly very good compliance with this principle, but unfortunately the collective action seemed to have been taken not in terms of the Disaster Management Act, which was the legislative framework chosen, but in the structures created like the National Corona Command Council. Principle 5. The measures must focus on the crisis only and not on other policy goals. Included in this principle is the idea that measures should not be discriminatory and protect vulnerable groups, and that the rules must apply equally and consistently. In this regard, there were a few court cases that interpreted the word strictly necessary in section 27(2)(n) of the Disaster Management Act that gives the minister the powers to make regulations that are strictly necessary for addressing the disaster. For instance, the tobacco ban was, in the Western Cape High Court, found not to be strictly necessary. On the other hand, the DA and solidarity cases, where the argument was made that the state cannot use transformation policies when allocating money, was found not to offend this principle. As to vulnerable groups in the Scalabrini case, it was found that excluding asylum seekers from receiving COVID relief is discriminatory. Waste pickers also tried to go to court and to perform their waste picking services, but was unsuccessful. And the issue of informal traders that needed permits to continue trading, the argument was that the DMA was used to get these traders to get their permits is also something that should be looked into. There were similar concerns with ECD centers. And of course, it is coming out constantly with these cram studies that COVID had a gendered impact and affected women, and especially poorer women, more direly than other people in the population. The rules were applied equally, though, and consistently. We remember the minister that was reprimanded for contravening lockdown rules, and a premier that was fined for not wearing a mask, for instance. Principle 6, oversight mechanisms must be protected. Here we focused mainly on the Parliament and the judiciary. Our evaluation here is that initially Parliament superseded its activities and a month into lockdown resumed virtually. They suspended their activities and then resumed virtually. It was a slow start, and the Helen Suzman Foundation did go to court to challenge the perceived absence of Parliament and the lack of oversight mechanisms. They ultimately lost, but we still think that there are valuable lessons that can be taken from the case, namely that it should be ensured that the legislature do continue their ordinary functions as soon as possible and provide oversight to the executive powers. As regard to the judicial oversight, it was present, and it was also possible to go to court and test the measures, which also happened. Principle 7 is the engagement with external experts and stakeholders. This includes, for instance, the World Health Organization and civil society. The government fared well in this regard. There was an initial strong focus on medical expertise, but it soon became apparent that this is also a societal problem. The Ministerial Advisory Committee also later on published their advice on the website, and this is something that should definitely be encouraged, preferably before or when the decisions are made. The only problem that we encountered here was that when civil society asked specific questions, for instance, questions surrounding the National Corona Command Council, the response was in some instances somewhat dismissive, when we thought it was a great opportunity for the state to engage and to explain their approach. Principle 8 is the freedom of expression. So accurate information during a pandemic is absolutely critical. While the government has an interest in countering fake news, it must also be very careful that when doing so, it doesn't stifle freedom of expression, especially scientific expression. Our evaluation. In the beginning, some dissenting voices were silenced or sidelined and reprimanded. In the second edition, we hope to expand on this and the idea of fostering and encouraging a society based on scientific thinking, where dissent and disagreement are seen as part of the process rather than wanting to cause harm. Principle 9, reform the law based on best practices locally and abroad. So this process is what we are busy with here today and what we have been busy with the past year, and is exactly adhering to this principle. And government should be applauded for embarking on this exercise. Self-reflection, as we all know, is not always easy or comfortable. As to the human rights and legal implication, this is also taken further in the next chapter, or the next chapter 3.2. South Africa went into the pandemic with many socioeconomic problems, and many of these problems then just got pronounced during the pandemic. We discuss under human rights the right to health, where concerns are raised that the management of non-COVID related health issues degraded during COVID. We also raise the initial lack of PPEs for health workers and the initial slow turnaround time for screening and testing. Here we discuss information and privacy concerns, which initially seemed quite invasive, but due to a quick response was adequately addressed. The financial and economic implications are mentioned, and we also speak to the problems of gender-based violence in this regard. Education comes in here, the disparities that came about due to COVID, as well as the problems surrounding ECD centers. So what are our conclusions and recommendations? We conclude that the Disaster Management Act was indeed the right choice, but care should be taken not to undermine the democratic order. The Disaster Management Act should be considered moving under the presidency, and it should be consistently implemented. A proper health strategy should ensure the safe reopening of the economy as soon as possible. That was back last year. And when we develop a risk-based strategy in South Africa, specific socio-economic context should be taken into account. Then trust and trustworthiness should be built on. Government should speak with one clear voice and should not try and silence critical voices based, especially not if they are based on scientific analysis. And then lastly, we should strengthen the culture of research. This is our basic, all our preliminary conclusions and recommendations. And with this, I thank you very much for listening and thank you very much for the opportunity to be part of this project.